I think the Dutch example provides us with a very interesting case study of whether we are seeing a rejection of the hard right or rather a rejection of one man, one person and a personality. Hello everyone. Welcome to Independent Thinking, the international affairs podcast of Chatham House. I'm Grégoire Roos, Director of Europe, Russia and Eurasia. It's been few days packed with adrenaline in Dutch politics. Voters cast their ballots on Wednesday after weeks of intense campaigning. Those elections were not planned, not necessary. It's just that Geert Wilders pulled out a coalition 6 months ago and we end up today with another snap election. We are recording in the immediate hours after the election, and it is still too soon to call. But it would seem that the traditional parties are back but trimmed, new parties squeezed out, and the trend that the Socialist Party is disappearing seems to be confirmed. With me today, two guests, Karien van Gennip, former Deputy Prime Minister of the Netherlands and a member of the Christian Democratic Party Appeal. Sébastien Maillard, my colleague from Chatham House Associate Fellow at the Europe Programme, and a special advisor to the Jacques Delors Institute and a former lecturer on EU affairs. Karien, I'd like to turn to you to gain a more critical and clearer overview of the results and why and how they matter.
What we see is that the party of Geert Wilders is losing seats. They're head-on with D66, the liberal left party. But if you look at the total right-wing bloc, then it's about stable. So Geert Wilders might have lost a couple of seats, but Forum for Democracy, even more far-right than Geert Wilders, won quite a number of seats. And another party that's a little bit less to the far-right, they won majorly. And together those three parties have about the same number of seats as they totally had before. So our far-right in the Netherlands is still between 25 and 30% of the votes.
Interestingly enough, I think you have a pro-Russian party that has actually increased. It's called the Forum for Democracy, I think you've mentioned. So it's also an interesting trend. Sébastien, is the worrying centre back? I mean, it seems like the Jetten, very young, 38, leader of the D66 party, is supposed to become the next PM. So it's not that boring, actually, looking at his profile.
It's difficult to draw any general conclusion on one single election in one of the European country. What I find significant are, perhaps out of this election that we see also in many other European countries, is first there's a strong personalization of candidates. I mean, we always talk about parties, but here what made, I think, D66 so successful is really the personality of its leader and his freshness. He's young and he's athletic, and he really, I think, performed well. He really revived that party. So Rob Jetten is really personalizes. And the same thing, I think, goes for the far right, when it's personalized under whether it's Wilders or Meloni, but we're talking about really persons more than party, and we see that in many countries. The other thing, and I think it's really perhaps the Netherlands more than everywhere, is the fragmentation. And I think in the previous parliament there were 16 parties. I don't know exactly how many there will be this time, but we see a fragmentation, of course, in the French National Assembly. We saw it in the Bundestag, in many of the, in Belgium, of course, for it's been going on for time. But the fact that we are going beyond the traditional left-right opposition, and we see it also in the UK with a surge of a Reform Party, that there can be many parties and this fragmentation. And the last trend, I think, interesting that we saw in this election, but that we see elsewhere, is how undecisive people are. I think in the Netherlands, before Wednesday, I think 40% of the Dutch still didn't know exactly how they would cast their vote. So you can have lots of surprises in many ways. There's a strong defiance against parties in general, and it's very true in France that people just don't trust politicians anymore.
What does it say about the challenges ahead?
Looking ahead, forming a government, both the fragmentation will play a role, but also the volatility of the outcomes. What you see today is that the winners of yesterday, and that's D66, the center-left Liberal Party, and the Christian Democrats, center-right, they both won majorly, but they lost majorly 2 years ago. So for WOP, it's really a journey of building a 4 or 5 party coalition ahead. That's not going to be easy.
Sébastien, I turn to you. What does that say in terms of a broader trend in Europe, across Europe? We have seen in Spain that Podemos and Ciudadanos are parties that have faded away, and for some of them even disappeared from the political landscape. The same could well happen in France. We do not know the future of President Macron's party. So how do you look at it as a global trend?
There is fragmentation, but there are some traditional parties that manage to resuscitate in a way. In the French presidential election, after Macron, which had performed in completely shaking up these traditional parties, we see both on the socialist side and the Gaullist some reappearance. For instance, in the European Parliament, those, let's call them traditional parties, mainstream parties, are still the ones that are ruling this European Parliament. I mean, the EPP or the Socialists and the Lib Dems. But what I find striking if you look at the whole continent, is really a move to the right generally. I mean, you mentioned Spain. It's maybe one of the very rare socialist leader in power today. And there's Denmark, there's Malta, and Lithuania. But besides these, you see the right and sometimes the far right in coalitions or governing. And I think this move to the right is really a general pattern that we've seen it in the Polish presidential election, in the Romanian presidential election, in the Czech elections. So it is a move to the right with some of those traditional pillars holding on.
It's interesting. So the architecture, in a way, of the traditional parties remain, but there's a shift of the agenda.
Yeah, exactly. We see it, for instance, in the European Parliament, the EPP is dominating and actually performed well in the last European elections. But inside the EPP, the ideas, the measures have moved more to the right. And even, for instance, in France, the LR, Gaullist party, inside it has moved more from the center-right to the judging more to the
conservative,
as right as it can be.
Right as it can be.
I think we have to be a little bit careful with qualifying it as a move to the right. Part it is anti-migration, part it is anti-reform. That's all true. But part it's also concerns from people about purchasing power, about perspective in life, about being able to being heard by the elite, the leading parties. And that's not right or left. I think that's really what's happened over the last, let's say, 20 years, is that we as center parties and as leading politicians, we have not paid enough attention to the concerns of all those people who were saying, like, we have concerns about housing, we have concerns about migration, we have concerns about being able to pay the bills. And there were parties, populist parties, that addressed those concerns, but then gave solutions that I don't agree with. But we have to make sure that we understand those concerns, because just framing it in left and right, I think, is not going to help us in the next elections and to win back those votes back to the middle of the political landscape.
People, as Karien said, are looking for answers, and I'm struck by the importance of the housing question. It was very important, I think significant in the Dutch campaign, but we see it elsewhere throughout Europe. It's not only the question of migration that often is taken by the populist party, but also the housing one. And for the very first time at the last European Council, the question of housing was debated at the level of heads of state of government, which was, I think, in history of all the European summits had never happened. So it shows that from Lisbon to London, Paris, or and Amsterdam and Barcelona, elsewhere, there is this question of housing and how you have to live far from the center, the urban center this time. It means that it's also a question that is really we see throughout Europe and that parties have difficulties in addressing.
Karien, Rob Jetten, in his victory speech, said something extremely interesting. He said that voters, millions of Dutch voters, had said farewell to the politics, I quote, of negativity, of hate, and of endless "no, we can't." I think what you stress is extremely interesting, because what we saw in this election is a centrist politician, could be center-left, center-right, but a centrist politician focused on three main priorities. Of course, the housing shortage. He also said he planned to invest in education and obviously tackle immigration, but came up with an agenda of yes, I can, compared with a narrative, especially on the hard right, but also on the hard left. No, we can't. We should do less. We should focus on less. We should close down. What does it say about the alternative or the possible alternatives in terms of narrative to the hard right?
Yeah, I think part of the Netherlands was really fed up with the negative emotions that especially Wilders is feeding. And those are the voters who voted D66 or the Christian Democrats. It's the same politics of hope. But you see a diverse landscape actually of half the population who's optimistic, who has hope, who has perspective in life, and the other half of the population who's confronted with those housing challenges and with those not being able to pay the bills and from migration to geopolitics. So there's even a backlash against military conscription that the middle parties want to reinstate. But the far right and some far left parties say, no, why would I fight for my country if my country doesn't deliver for me? So you see half of the Netherlands basically in a backlash negative emotion, not having perspective in life. And the other half is very optimistic and says there is perspective in life, there is hope. And those are the two extremes that you see back in these elections. And that's also going to be difficult. When you want to form a coalition government, you have to be a prime minister and ministers for all people of the Netherlands, not just for your own bubble. And to bring those bubbles together who are getting farther and farther apart, that's really going to be a very difficult challenge.
I think it's fascinating to see that Geert Wilders is not really fitting in what I would call the usual pattern of the hard right leader. I would see two. Trump's maximalism, you say whatever you want because you know you can pretty much do everything you can and you want. And the second would be Giorgia Meloni. So, of course, you move from a radical discourse to, once you're in power, a more accommodating, consensus-building sort of leadership. And it would seem, looking at Europe, that the latter has a greater prospect of success than the former. If I look at Geert Wilders, I do not see him fit in any of those. Is he a kind of third way? And did we see yesterday the kind of limits, if not failure, of that third way? Meaning he is more powerful outside the government than inside the government. It looks to me as someone who has actually way more influence out than in. So in a way, one could argue that he has somewhat won yesterday. He kept a significant figure in parliament and he will remain influential out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. In the last government, which lasted only a year and a half, but Geert Wilders was the leading party. He had the largest party. He did not become prime minister. He stayed in parliament and he actually assumed an opposition role against his own government. And in that way, trying to become more influential. And also today, he's not going to make prime minister because all the other parties have said, we don't want to govern with you again. But he will regain his opposition role in parliament. And he has managed to draw actually all the other parties more to the right, more towards his agenda. But he didn't deliver at all when he was in government and his ministers didn't deliver. But people don't see that necessarily. People who vote for him see somebody who addresses their concerns and somebody who claims he was worked against in government. And that's why he had to make the government fall. And if you would vote for him again, he would solve all the problems.
I think, Grégoire, you're right to point out that there are the far right that is maximalist and provocative and against the euro, against even exiting the EU, and one, I would say, hard right that Meloni embodies, that is pro-Euro, pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO, and tries to drive its liberal agenda, but while also becoming a bit mainstream and normalizing itself. We'll see in France, Le Pen's party a bit trying to find its way between both, because in the European Parliament, its MEPs sit with the patriots, with Orban, with I would say with the maximalist, with Salvini, while Meloni is more trying to look as normal as it can. And it's also an issue for traditional right-wing parties, the EPP and the Gaullists in France, to see how they to what extent they can also collaborate or not with those parties. So we will see, and it's really will be very decisive in the coming elections in many countries, how the far right normalizes itself a bit, and how the traditional right is able to perhaps to dwell with them.
I think the Dutch example provides us with a very interesting case study of whether we are seeing a rejection of the hard right, or rather a rejection of one man, one person and a personality. Looking at the headlines across the world, not just Europe, it's all about how and why the hard right in the Netherlands has lost, and why this might indicate a larger trend in Europe. It seems a bit premature to say so, and for me a bit short-sighted, because if I listen to you, Karien, and I think this is also what you were stressing, Sébastien, it's been mostly rejection of Wilders and his inability. He brought down the coalition 6 months ago. But what about Europe? What about the larger trend in Europe?
There is a geographical divide we see throughout many elections patterns throughout Europe, where you see a rural right and urban left, to really put it bluntly. There is people who are from the countryside in remote areas where public services have left and they feel put aside and not represented, and will vote more. We see it to the far right. Actually, it's interesting to see also the far left is very weakened in many countries today, but the populist far right can take these votes, and in the urban cities you see it in Budapest, or where Orbán is not performing. You see it in Paris, where Le Pen is not performing.
Even in Turkey,
as well, in Istanbul. Well, the opposition and the cosmopolitan views are much more widespread.
Karien, I'm interested to better understand, because you have a very strong banking experience. You now sit on the board of a very important European chip manufacturer. I'd love to understand how the private sector is looking at that fragmentation. We've mentioned, of course, the Netherlands, we've mentioned France, but there are many other countries in Europe where political fragmentation makes it impossible for stable political leadership to emerge. How does the business look at it? And what does it say about the strength and weakness of the European economy?
I think Draghi pointed out the urgency that we really need to invest in Europe, and that we need to reform our economies all across the board. And we are slow in doing so. I think that's a major concern, not just of the business world, but of everybody. And we need to do that, whether it's innovation, digitalization. But we also need to do it in a way that people can actually be part of it. So if you invest in digitalization and a digital divide becomes bigger, you're actually working against your own people. The same goes for climate change. When you invest in climate change, you need to make sure that those small, medium companies that cannot afford it, or those households that cannot afford it, you help them go through it and build their climate resistance as well. But for the role and the responsibility of businesses, that's a very interesting one, because what you see in many countries is that some businesses take up that responsibility and kind of take over partly of the government of being that stable force in a country. You see that in France, you see that in the Netherlands, in Germany. And some other companies decide to invest outside of Europe because they say it's not enough, there's no capital market, so I'll go for my IPO or for my investment to the US or even to China.
Sébastien, you've been involved in the LETA report. I don't betray any secret, and you've covered extensively those questions of competitiveness at the same time as populism. So how do you approach that prospect?
It is actually an issue today for many far-right parties. We're talking about how to be business-friendly while remaining populist. And we see it today in France, for instance, how Jordan Bardella tries to look very appealing to the business employers and not scare them, while also still trying to keep his stronghold in popular votes. So we saw it also with how Meloni was actually backed by Draghi in a way to really be reassuring also to the markets. So it's actually the first challenge for a far-right party that comes to power is actually to have the business on his side or her side and try not to be look spooky. So we also see it also in the UK with how the reform also tries not to look completely unorthodox to the markets. So there's really a first question here for the far-right parties who want not to be maximalist but to really gain power.
President Macron has been criticized by some for somehow dissolving by passing them the intermediary bodies, especially unions. So one actually ends up with no real intermediary between popular anger and political parties. What lessons do we draw, and how can you somehow revive those intermediary bodies, of course at domestic but also European level?
We have in many European countries a crisis of representative democracy, and we were saying people don't feel represented, and this is also why there is such a fragmentation, as we were talking about earlier, in the parliament, where and there is volatility. And I think it's key to restore our democracies to have a deep role of what we call, broadly speaking, civil society, and the best representative of civil societies are these intermediaries, whether it's trade unions, employers associations, civil society organizations, all kinds. But if you are too vertical in today's society, it actually then gets back to you, and that's, I think, what Macron has probably misjudged, especially when he conducted the pension reform, which was seen as something completely vertical and authoritarian.
I think that there's one country that seems to be standing out. It's the United Kingdom. You actually have unions that have retained significant influence in the public discussion, and yet the hard right is doing so well in the polls. Also, we saw last week that there was a kind of a pebble in their shoes, and the path to power of Nigel Farage doesn't seem to be as straight as it looked some months ago.
So looking at the UK, I think first, the impact of Brexit negatively on the economic growth has been quite substantive. So that's one. And no economic growth means no room for investments or reorganizations or reforms. And the second one is, if you look at healthcare, for instance, or education in the UK, that's really lagging behind continental Europe. Quality of healthcare, quality of education. And I think people feel that. So I don't know the UK that well, but when you live in a country, my daughter actually lives in the UK, and you feel that you have to go back to continental Europe for healthcare, that's saying something about that country. So I think there are specific challenges to the UK that make it easier, so to say, for the far right to gain traction.
Karien, I know you need to be set free imminently. I have one question, extremely easy to answer. Does Donald Trump have any influence over far-right politics in Europe?
I think many in the far right admire Donald Trump and see him as an example how they want to play politics. But I do think that Trump's maximalism and the way he does politics is not going to work across Europe, because across Europe we have the tradition that we take the minority interest into account, that we build consensus, that we build coalitions, and that's why Europe in the long run is so successful.
For the far right, Trump is a model, but also there is a fascination for Vladimir Putin. We see it with Orban, we see it with Le Pen, and the way also their interference from in the elections in Europe from these leaders, and it pushes the far right in many countries in a sort of contradiction, because you end up being either seen as an agent of a foreign force, such as Trump or Putin, in the hands of them, and actually voting against the interest of your own country. It's very significant for it pushes actually those leaders, nationalist leaders, in some sort of contradiction, because although they praise Trump, then they end up with having to live with tariffs that they have to fight.
I think we should also look at the larger kind of MAGA influence, not just Donald Trump. The second aspect is when some radicals in the US try to impersonate Trump, it simply doesn't work. There is something really specific to Donald Trump himself. So I'm always wary of any kind of copycat because it never pays off. And we've seen the limits of Trump's maximalism if we look at Hungary and Orbán. I mean, he's been very isolated, even politically. I think one last aspect is that what has just happened in the Netherlands, if there is one party that will definitely learn a lesson, it's in France, the National Rally, because we will know in January or February whether Marine Le Pen can run or not. And if she cannot run, this will mean that Bardella can really stir the party further towards the center to a certain respect. And he will, of course, much more appeal to the business communities. And Bardella is not someone who bears the Le Pen name, so he will just, as he has started already, distance himself from the Le Pen family. And second, he has always, it's interesting that he said that Sarkozy was the last great president of France, so really much more leaning towards the traditional right. So there seems to be a kind of circle of the reason, as one French commentator put it some years ago, that even the far-right voters tend to resort to, we are hard-right voters, but we expect some maturity in the way our leaders exert power. I don't know how you see it.
I think this is really goes back to this normalization versus maximalist approach you were describing, and Meloni, in that sense, masters this plan of gaining power. For instance, what provokes the fact that Le Pen failed to succeed in 2017 is that she was advocating for Brexit. She was even advocating for getting out of the euro and go back to the European currency unit.
She mixed the two. She mixed the two.
So
actually,
people really got confused and were really saying, where is this taking us? What will happen to my savings? And Meloni has understood this completely, that you can do your culture wars domestically, but remain mainstream, business-friendly in order to be able to govern. And I think it's this pattern that we may see with Bardella should he lead the presidential campaign in France for 2027.
That has been such a fascinating tour de force of populism, not just in the Netherlands, but across Europe, and its prospect, and of course what it means for Europe's future and its economy. So thank you again very much, Karien and Sébastien. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. You can follow our extended coverage of populism, of the outcome of the Dutch elections, and of upcoming important elections throughout Europe, and many other important geopolitical developments around the world at chathamhouse.org. And please join us next week for the Independent Thinking podcast.